Well, I suppose it first started, I went to Derbyshire with a friend and his father when I was about 12, and we went up onto Bleak Low, and it was probably about this time of year, so it was quite adventurous really, and everything was covered in hoarfrost. It was amazing. I was just absolutely captivated by it. And so from then on, for about 3 years, myself and some friends would just go to Derbyshire, go walking and youth hostling, and there were no parents involved, we just did it for our own back. And I started thinking about, like most people, this climbing was interesting, watching people. And so my friend and I, Mark, we did the usual thing. We got a washing line and we went out to a local sandstone quarry in Nottingham and had a bit of a play on that. And we thought, maybe we really ought to sort of do something properly, you know. So we went to a lecture by Doug Scott, who's a Nottingham guy, at the school. And he just, I think he failed to do the Southwest Face in '72. And we went to his lecture, and at the end he said, well, what do you recommend? And he recommended this Meadows Boys Club in Nottingham, which was this really rough area. And it's quite a rough club. But anyway, we joined, and we sort of got a few things. They took us out, and we did some climbing with them, and then we went and bought our first rope. And then sort of taught ourselves really for a while, and we'd occasionally go with these people and occasionally go around, and that's how it started really. And just going up to Derbyshire from Nottingham every weekend, either on the bus or thumbing, and we got in a barn in Baslow, and everything was based from there until I went to uni then. Yeah, so it started like a lot of people, I think, walking into climbing.
So obviously this isn't your first book. I think you've done a previous guidebook a while ago, and then you've done the Peak Rock book. How did you first get into sort of writing books and things like that? Because obviously you were a climber, and then you at some stage decided to move into climbing books. How did that sort of come about?
I remember I used to be really interested when I was walking. I used to read books about the Peak District, and I always had this sort of research type mind where I used to want to learn as much as possible about everything. And when I started climbing, I got some guides, and then my dad started getting me. He was Climbing Rambler at the time, the magazine, and occasionally would have news reports, and I'd find myself sort of writing in the new routes into the guidebook to fit them in. And then I'd find I didn't have space, so I'd just sort of rewrite that section as an updated section. So I was sort of writing mini guides when I was about 16 or 17, and then I went to Sheffield Uni, and some friends who were working on, I think it became the 83 guide, I think, studied Millstone, asked me, did I want to be a field worker? So 79, I just went along North Stanage, just climbing everything, and put a script in for it, and that's how it started. And a few years later, I joined the guidebook committee. I was on that for 20 years in every role there, secretary, treasurer, business manager, did loads of field work as well. And even when I left that, I carried on doing field work and writing sections and proofing up until just a couple of years ago, really, checking, rewriting stuff. So yeah, it's something I've done all my climbing life, really, just about. Just really enjoy it.
The guidebook that you've just done from complete scratch. I mean, what goes into writing a guidebook? How do you even begin to go about writing the first few pages?
I decided I wanted to do a selected. I mean, that's what I was asked to do. Vertebrate Publishing said, would you be interested in selected guidebook Gritstone? And I thought, well, you know, I've worked for other people for 40 years, effectively, so it'd be really good to do my own guide. And it was just a question of sitting down and thinking, right, what are the best crags in the Peak District? And what are on those crags, what are the best routes on there? Try and get a decent grade range as well. And then just really start writing them down. And I had a helping that they'd previously published one, which was limited up to hard VS, and I just stripped out all the text apart from the headings, so I wouldn't have to type those in. And that was, they were only a few of the routes. And basically, I just had to type the rest in myself and just work from scratch and write the whole lot up. And so it meant going to cliffs. I mean, I've climbed for 50 years virtually on grit, so I knew them very well. But I still went out because you forget routes you've done, and there are always ones you've not done. So in about the 4 or 5 years I worked on it, I did over 180 visits to there's about 35 crags, but when you think one of them's Stanage, and the other one's the Roaches, it's quite, quite a lot of stuff. And I climbed over 1,300 of the routes, either for the first time or just one time. I thought I ought to sort of remind myself about, just to really make sure it was absolutely accurate and up to date. So it involved checking everything, like parking access, approaches, getting between the climbs, and the descriptions graded a lot, and the lines of the routes as well.
So are all the descriptions predominantly your own personal description of these routes?
Oh, wow. Yeah, absolutely. And if you see anything that you recognise from a previous guide, it's because I wrote it in a previous guide. I still see things in BMC guides that I remember from writing 2 guides ago or something like that.
Yeah.
That are my comments and things. So it is all my text. Yeah, definitely.
So obviously this is a select guide to the Peak District. Yeah. How did you choose what would be included and what wouldn't be included? Was it like really hard? Did you start with loads of stuff and then have to trim it down to try and fit it into one book? Or
I because I wanted it to be a selected guide and for people who maybe weren't necessarily local, people who learned to drive into the area, then I wanted to make sure that they were the best crags possible. And also that those crags had a decent number of good quality routes on. So certain crags, even if they had a couple of good routes on, they just weren't enough routes to make it worth going to, or they're a long walk in just to do 2 routes or something. So I've tried to concentrate on crags which had a good number of good quality routes with a good range. And that was just from personal experience, really. And sometimes I go along and I just start climbing. I think, actually, that's really brilliant. It's got no stars in the current guide. And I do it and think, well, that's good. I'm going to put that in. It's 2 stars. And so, some were added and some were removed. You do, and you think, oh, that's terrible. I'm not putting that in. So it was sort of, you wouldn't be surprised by most of the choices because they're all well-known climbs, most of them, but others, but they're ones that you maybe wouldn't expect to see in a guidebook. But they're worth putting in. Is
there a sort of favourite hidden gem of yours in the guidebook from the Peak District?
There's a little one Kinder that I soloed, and I couldn't believe how bad it looked and yet how well it climbed, and that was about Severe or something. And I remember saying something like, don't laugh, just have a go at this. And I think I'll put that in the description. Don't laugh, just have a go, because we've all done routes where they look terrible from the bottom, and yet actually there's hidden holds and they're clean, and from below you can't see the fact that things are clean. So there's one like, but they're I think lots of them will be quite well known, I would imagine. But there will be some surprises in that, I'm sure. And I think there are also surprises in some of the grading as well, because I went all over the peak climbing these. I'm probably the only person who's done all of them in a very short amount of time. So there's a consistency across the grades now. So I tried to sort of grade them as all as if they're on Stanage. And so traditional areas that might have sandbags, or people who say, oh yeah, it's really tough over there, or the moors are really tough, or Staffordshire tough. Then there's been a bit of leveling. I've sort of ended up upgrading a few, so there is some consistency now. So you'll get severes that maybe in LBSs and RBSs that are E2 because they just weren't RBS.
Yeah.
These weren't severe. One of the problems with checking on places like that is that people, it depends on the field worker who's doing it, but some are really good and others just sort of wander along and just do a few of the ones they've not done, or the harder ones they want to try. And they just assume that something graded severe in 1945 is still severe. Well, 1945 severe is pretty hard. And if you try them now, you find they're not severe at all, they're much harder. So there's an element of consistency I think I brought in by doing the whole thing myself. So the grades should be consistent.
Grades are always such a debatable, should be this grade, should be that grade. But actually, I think what you've done and climbed all of the routes in the different areas in such a short space of time probably does give you quite a unique
perspective,
ability to be able to.
Yeah, I don't like sandbags much.
No.
I just really don't enjoy it. I don't enjoy it when guides say, "Oh yeah, RBS, ha ha ha," There's no fun. Getting trouble or something from the grade.
Yeah.
I think what I wanted to do with this guidebook, the reason I took it on, was that I wanted to produce a readable book. I want people to read this book before they go climbing. It's not something to take to the crowd and get out and think, well, what do we do? When I was young, I used to read a guidebook and I'd go, oh, I want to do that, I want to do that, it's amazing. I read history bits, I read the descriptions, and I really get inspired by it. And I want people to, well, that's the way I've tried to write it, such that, you know, the passion I've got for climbing at Gritstone and climbing in general is being put into the descriptions, the descriptions of the areas and the crags and the routes. So people will really want to climb them, you know. So they're quite, this is quite descriptive. It's definitely not topo guide. It's about as far away as you can get from a topo guide.
Yeah.
And I've tried to put stuff that's sort of interesting, informative, historical stuff in that people wouldn't realise about routes to give them the context. Because I think that's really important that when we're climbing these things, whatever grade they are, even the easier ones, that there's a historical context to actually how important or difficult they were in their time.
Mm.
You know, things like Stonius crack on Black Rocks, you know, sowing that back in the 1900s was really quite hard. And doing Promontory Traverse in a pair of Plymouths with just 3 runners. You know, the thing, you know, now you do it nowadays maybe with a set of cams and you think, oh, so bad.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Black Slab on Stanage, you know, Hargreaves route, with a bag of cams now. People still find it quite hard. You think you solo and getting severe. And since cams came out, it's gone to BS.
Yeah.
And we figured that one. And the amazing thing about Black Slab Hargreaves, I don't know if you know the route, but they used to belay 3/4 up on a flake just to have some sort of protection for the route. You bring the guy up and you do the last 10 foot or something. And there's another lovely route on Stanage, on High Neb, where they would take a belay by wedging themselves into an off width halfway up. Nothing to tie on with. They just wedge themselves in and bring the guy up and then carry on. So there's some sort of protection. You know, it's brilliant. So I've tried to get that sort of history in, and also to describe routes from the grade of the people doing them. You know, if you're really severe's your limit and you've got to do a sort of step up move and there's not much gear, that's a desperate move. And I want get that flavour in the route rather than it be, you know, some sort of E4 leader who's done it and thought, well, I didn't notice that.
Yeah.
Mm.
So I'm trying to write from the perspective of the people who are climbing at that grade. And I've also put in things like comments about moving on, such that people are aware of routes that are at the bottom of the grade or at the top of the grade. So if they want to do an E1, they're looking for RBSs, which say at the top of the grade are a good stepping stone for E1. Or an E1 that says at the bottom, this is a good first lead, you know. So I've tried to indicate things for progression. And also which routes are good for beginners to either lead or not lead, but just second, because there's just no gear on them, but they're quite easy to climb. They're sort of not too technical and, you know, almost a bit like this. But so I've tried to put lots of information to help people as well. So hopefully people will like it anyway.
It sounds quite a nice, unique
Yeah.
take on guidebooks.
Yeah.
I've added a sort of few more features as well that are more to do with the way grit is perhaps being approached now, in that I've put lots of font grades in. So
Okay.
if there's any highballable stuff,
Yeah.
I've put a font grade in, and it'll have an exclamation mark if it's just a bit highball.
Yeah.
And I've also explained that with routes that are both sort of gradable both ways. So you can have something like Oedipus on Frogger, which if you want to go on on-site that, it's probably E4-6B. But it's in reality, if you pad it, it's got like a font 6B plus boulder problem start into a font 5 plus exclamation mark finish.
Yeah.
And that's what it breaks down to if you want to pad it out.
Yeah.
So I've sort of tried to include not descriptions, but grades in which give some illustration of the different styles in which they can be done. And for anything that's E5 or above that is appropriate, I've put French grades in.
Yeah.
So you get a bit of an idea. I mean, for me, if somebody told me there was an unprotected route with French 6A, I wouldn't bother me.
Yeah.
I'd be quite happy to sell a French 6A Gritstone slab. If it was getting to 6C, I'd be going to go, I'm not sure you want to sell that. And that would probably mean more to me than E grade, in a way, you know. And so I put French grades in for the harder routes as well. Just not all of them, just ones which you've got might be appropriate.
I think that's really good.
It's very modern, actually.
There's been a lot of debate about the E-grades and the trad grade system kind of falling apart a little bit towards those top end climbs. So I think, yeah, having that kind of French grade there as well does give you that, much better understanding of what you're letting yourself in for.
Yeah, if you know, I mean, something like before access on cloud, if you know it's sort of 7A strip 7A plus, probably means a bit more to you than it being in the 6-7 bracket, because then you think, well, actually, I can do that. Happy to do that without gear if you're that type of grade climber. But with the upper grade stuff, with the hardest routes, because I've done all the routes up to E3 in the guide, 99% of all the routes up to E5. About 94-point-something% of all the routes in the guide. And of the harder ones, which are like E6, E7 and above, I sort of work with friends who I've known for years. I'm from working on Pete Rock, Pete Whitaker and Tom Randall and James Pearson, he helped a bit. So people who've actually done the route. So I was absolutely clear that even the hardest route, I would get some feedback in. Yeah. About how hard they were, and check the descriptions and check the grades and the French grades as well. So I made sure that everything was pretty well researched. Because one of the interesting things was you find some, a guide will say, oh, there's no gear, but they forgot that you can buy microcams now.
Yeah.
So you can find Severes, which used to have no gear, and there's a bomber microcam on it.
Yeah.
And things like that. So it's interesting to have down these things since I was solo and gear, because that was one of the things I had to do. I just couldn't top rope. I had to top rope, I was shunting. Most of them were soloing. Some I used to go to people and lead stuff. But, you shunt with a load of gear because you want to know if it's protected.
Yeah.
So you're carrying up to the crag, 2 ropes, shunt gear, all your gear.
Yeah.
And to do it. So days on Kinder were sort of.
It's a long walk. Yeah.
And the annoying thing was when you get home and think, you start typing it up and you go, oh shit, I didn't go and check that run song. I remember the length of it. I go back and up down and get bloody gear out and check it out. And there it was a real bomb. You think, oh god, yeah, there is a good run there.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right.
I mean, that is one of the things that changes over time, as the climbing technology and the availability of gear and things like just cams and then micro cams and things like that have sort of made what once were pretty necky climbs a lot so
Anyway, thanks very much.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for the time and speaking to you. Yeah, and good luck with the book. I hope it does really well for you.
Yeah, thanks. I didn't go in for it for money. That's not really why I've done it. I mean, pre-rock, still everything's on charity, and none of us took any money for it, and it still goes to charity. But I just don't want to do it and nobody buy it. I sort of feel like it's quite a nice thing. I hope people would at least look at it and read it and think, actually, I quite like that. Buy that.
I'm looking forward to it. Looking forward to it coming out.
Okay. Oh, lovely. Okay, well, thanks very much.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.